The cold hum of machinery filled the air, accompanied by the faint flicker of fluorescent lights. She sat hunched in the center of the containment cell, her translucent skin glowing faintly in the dimness. Her eyes, large and luminescent, scanned the sterile room. She had once thought this was a nightmare she would wake up from, a bad dream conjured by exhaustion and fear. But the cold steel walls, the constant scrutiny, and the sharp pain of needles had assured her this was no dream. The humans on the other side of the glass treated her as a curiosity. Their clipped voices rattled off data points, describing her as if she were a specimen, not a living, sentient being. Increased bioluminescent activity under stress, one noted, not even glancing at her face. Another scribbled something on a clipboard while a third adjusted a device that whirred ominously. They never met her eyes. She had learned that was deliberate. Acknowledgement would force them to confront her personhood, and that was something they clearly wished to avoid. She remembered the chaos that had brought her here. The crash of her ship on an uncharted world, the desperate hope as she signaled for aid. Instead of help, she had been greeted with violence. Hunters had encircled her, shouting in a language she barely understood. She had tried to speak, to explain, but they had fired nets that bound her limbs, stung her skin, and silenced her voice. From there, she had been dragged to this facility, subjected to endless prodding and observation. They labeled her a monster, treating her as if her mere existence was a threat. Each day was a loop of the same torment. She would wake to the sharp click of boots, the hiss of the door, and the cold metal of restraints around her wrists and ankles. They spoke over her, about her, as if she were deaf to their words. "Muscle composition is remarkable," one scientist murmured as another jabbed a needle into her arm, ignoring the flinch it provoked. The pain was almost secondary to the indignity. She was not an object. She had thoughts, emotions, memories of a family she might never see again. But none of that mattered to these humans. To them, she was just the subject. Despite the brutality, she refused to show them her fear. They wanted her to react, to give them a reason to justify their treatment. Instead, she sat silently, her glowing eyes locking onto theirs whenever possible. It unsettled some of them, she could tell. They shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the intelligence behind her gaze with the monster they believed her to be. That small victory kept her going, a shred of defiance in a world determined to crush her spirit. One day, a new figure entered the room. He was unassuming, dressed in the same sterile uniform as the others, but his demeanor was different. He didn't bark orders or avoid looking at her. In fact, his eyes lingered on her longer than most, not with fear or revulsion, but with something closer to curiosity, or perhaps sympathy. He was assigned to perform basic maintenance on the containment equipment, checking monitors and recalibrating the force field that separated her from the rest of the facility. At first, she paid him little attention. Humans had proven themselves cruel and untrustworthy. But then, something strange happened. As he worked, he glanced at her and, in a quiet voice, said, "I'm sorry about all of this." The words were so unexpected that she froze, unsure if she had heard him correctly. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with apology, not with acknowledgement. The man didn't elaborate. He continued his work, occasionally stealing glances at her. She studied him in return, trying to understand his motives. Was this some kind of trick? A new method to manipulate her? But his actions betrayed no malice. If anything, he seemed nervous, like someone walking a tightrope. When he finished his task, he hesitated at the door, his gaze meeting hers once more before he left. In the days that followed, his presence became a regular occurrence. Unlike the others, he didn't handle her roughly or speak about her as if she were an object. His hands were steady but gentle when adjusting her restraints or checking her vitals. Occasionally, he would murmur soft reassurances under his breath. "Just a little longer," he said once, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machines. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had received from anyone else. Her skepticism didn't fade easily. She had learned the hard way that humans could not be trusted. Yet there was something different about him. He moved with a hesitance that suggested he didn't fully belong in this place, His kindness seemed genuine, not calculated. Against her better judgment, she began to hope that he might be the exception. One morning, as he entered her cell, she noticed something different. He carried a small object in his hand, a piece of cloth, folded neatly. He hesitated before offering it to her, his eyes darting to the cameras that monitored every corner of the room. "It's not much," he said softly, placing it on the table where her food tray usually sat. She stared at it, uncomprehending, until he unfolded it to reveal a simple, soft blanket. She had grown used to the cold of the cell, but the gesture warmed her in a way she hadn't felt since her capture. Tentatively, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the fabric. He didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he smiled faintly, a fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. For the first time since her imprisonment, she allowed herself to believe that not all humans were monsters. Days passed, and her skepticism slowly gave way to cautious curiosity. The human technician continued his visits, each time offering a small gesture that felt out of place in the sterile, hostile environment. He would adjust her restraints so they didn't cut into her skin as deeply or quietly whisper, "It'll be okay." Once, he lingered longer than usual, pretending to inspect a console while muttering, "You don't deserve this." His actions were subtle, almost imperceptible to the others in the facility. He never overtly disobeyed orders or interfered with the experiments, but his presence brought a faint sense of reprieve from the otherwise unrelenting hostility. She watched him carefully, trying to determine whether his kindness was genuine or some elaborate manipulation. His gestures, while small, were consistent, and for the first time, she began to see a glimmer of humanity beyond the cruelty she had endured. One day, during a routine session, he approached her cell carrying something unusual. It was small and rectangular, with a smooth surface that glowed faintly when he touched it. He placed it on the table and glanced around nervously, ensuring no one else was watching. "You can use this to write," he said in a low voice, sliding the device closer to her. "I thought, maybe you had something to say." She hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. For so long, she had been treated as an object, her voice silenced by fear and isolation. But his expression held no malice, only a tentative hope that she might respond. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the device. The screen lit up, and she stared at it for a moment before cautiously tapping on it. A word appeared. "Why?" The simplicity of her question seemed to catch him off guard. He glanced at the cameras again, his anxiety evident, but he didn't pull away. "Because," he began, struggling to find the words. "Because you're not what they say you are. You're not a monster. I can see that." Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she tapped another word. "Help." The plea was direct, and she watched him closely for his reaction. His shoulders tensed, and for a moment she thought he might back away, unwilling to commit to the risk. But then he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll try." Over the next several days, their interactions deepened. He continued to bring her small items, nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to show he was trying. A piece of fruit from the staff cafeteria, a small towel to replace the rough material she had been given, even a simple drawing he had sketched of the stars. She didn't understand the purpose of these gifts at first, but over time, they began to chip away at the wall of distrust she had built around herself. She used the device sparingly, knowing that any evidence of their communication could lead to severe consequences for both of them. When she did write, her messages were brief but meaningful. "Why do they hate me?" she asked once, her glowing eyes fixed on his face as he read the words. His response was quiet, almost ashamed. "Fear. They don't understand you, so they assume the worst." Her questions grew more pointed as the days went on. "Do you believe I'm dangerous?" she wrote, her gaze unflinching. He hesitated, but his answer was firm. "No. I think they're afraid of what they don't know. But I don't see a monster. I see someone who's been hurt." His words resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. For so long, she had viewed humanity as a singular, cruel entity, a species that thrived on domination and destruction. But here was one who defied that image, who seemed to carry a burden of guilt for what his kind had done. She began to wonder if perhaps there was more to humanity than she had assumed. One day, he took a greater risk. During a particularly invasive experiment, he positioned himself between her and the lead scientist, subtly adjusting the equipment to reduce its impact on her. The scientist didn't notice, too preoccupied with his observations, but she did. She looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. He didn't say anything, but the faint nod he gave her was enough to convey his intentions. Her trust in him grew, though it was still tinged with caution. She knew the facility was a place of lies and manipulation, and even his kindness could be a trap. But the consistency of his actions made it harder to hold on to her doubts. He didn't just speak of compassion, he demonstrated it in ways that were small but significant. She began to reciprocate in subtle ways, using the device to share fragments of her thoughts. "I miss the stars," she wrote once, her fingers trembling as she admitted something so personal. He read the message and nodded, his expression softening. "I do too," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Maybe someday you'll see them again." Their connection, though fragile, became a lifeline for her. In a world that sought to dehumanize her at every turn, he was the one reminder that she was not alone. He treated her not as an object of study but as a being with thoughts, emotions, and dreams. And in doing so, he began to restore something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The air in the facility grew heavier with tension as whispers circulated about her fate. She couldn't understand every word the humans said, but their tones and the occasional harsh term, dissection, disposal, transfer, made their intentions clear. She had endured the experiments, the prodding, and the constant humiliation, but now it was clear her time was running out. She wouldn't survive much longer if she stayed here. The technician, her only source of solace, seemed to sense the urgency as well. His demeanor had shifted, his glances more furtive, his hands trembling slightly when he interacted with her. One day, when the room was empty except for the two of them, he leaned in closer than ever before. "They're planning to move you," he murmured, his voice tight. "If they do, I won't be able to help you anymore. We don't have much time." She met his eyes, searching for deception, but there was none. He looked scared, not just for himself, but for her. Slowly she nodded, her glowing eyes narrowing with determination. She tapped a single word on the device he had given her. "How?" He hesitated, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he was about to say. "I have a plan," he whispered. "It's risky, but it might work." He quickly sketched out the details, his voice low and hurried. The facility had vulnerabilities, blind spots in the security cameras, a back exit rarely used, and most importantly, a small, unguarded hangar where an old transport ship was stored. He had access to the systems that controlled the locks and alarms. If they timed everything perfectly, they could escape unnoticed. She listened intently, her mind racing. The plan was fragile, dependent on countless variables beyond their control. But it was also her only chance. She tapped another word. "When?" "Tomorrow," he replied. "I'll disable the cameras during the night shift. Be ready." The hours leading up to the escape were some of the longest of her life. Every sound, every footstep outside her cell, made her heart race. She reviewed the plan in her mind, memorizing every detail. Trusting him was a gamble, but she had no other options. If he betrayed her, it would mean the end. When the time came, he returned as promised. His movements were quick and precise as he deactivated the force field around her cell. "We have to move fast," he said, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her instincts screaming to stay hidden, but then she stepped forward. This was her chance, and she couldn't afford to waste it. The facility was eerily quiet as they made their way through the corridors. He led the way, his posture tense, his eyes scanning every corner. She followed closely, her senses heightened. The air smelled of antiseptic and metal, a constant reminder of the place she was leaving behind. They avoided the main pathways, sticking to service corridors and maintenance shafts. Twice, they had to stop and hide as guards passed by, their heavy boots echoing in the stillness. When they reached the first security checkpoint, he pulled out a small device and pressed a few buttons. The door's lock clicked open, and the faint hum of the cameras went silent. "It's working," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She tapped his shoulder lightly, drawing his attention. Her glowing eyes conveyed what words couldn't, gratitude mixed with urgency. The next part of the journey was more dangerous. They had to cross an open corridor with limited cover. He glanced at her, his expression conflicted. "We have to run," he whispered. She nodded, her body tensing in preparation. Together, they sprinted across the space, their footsteps barely audible against the polished floor. Her agility surprised him. Despite the weeks of confinement, she moved with a speed and grace that seemed almost otherworldly. They made it to the other side just as voices echoed from a nearby hallway. The final stretch to the hangar was the most nerve-wracking. Alarms could go off at any moment, and any delay could mean capture. He used his access to override the locks on the hangar door, but it took longer than expected. She stood behind him, her glowing skin casting a faint light in the darkness. Her senses were on high alert, her muscles coiled like springs, ready to fight if needed. Finally, the door slid open, revealing the transport ship. It was old and dusty, but it looked functional. "This is it," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and urgency. "Get inside. I'll activate the launch sequence." She didn't move immediately. Instead, she placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. He turned to look at her, confusion and concern etched on his face. She tapped a single question on the device. "You?" His expression softened, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I can't go with you," he said. "If I disappear, they'll know I helped you. You'll have a better chance if they think you escaped on your own." She shook her head, her glowing eyes filled with resolve. She typed quickly. "They'll know anyway." He hesitated, clearly torn. The sound of distant voices growing louder made the decision for him. "Fine," he said, his voice shaking. "Let's go." They boarded the ship together, and he worked quickly to power it up. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her fingers gripping the armrests, as the engines roared to life. The hangar doors began to open, but before the ship could lift off, an alarm blared. "They've found us," he said, his voice tense. "Hold on." The ship shot out of the hangar, narrowly avoiding the blast of gunfire from the guards below. As they ascended into the night sky, she looked out at the stars, her heart pounding. She was free, but the journey wasn't over. Beside her, the human sat quietly, his face pale but determined. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they might have a future, one where she wasn't a monster and he wasn't her captor, but something more. The transport ship hurtled through the void, its engines humming steadily as the stars stretched endlessly ahead. She sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the view outside. For the first time since her capture, she felt the vast expanse of freedom. But the reality of the situation weighed heavily on her. This escape, however successful, was not the end. It was the beginning of something much larger, something uncertain. Beside her, the human worked tirelessly, his hands moving over the ship's controls with a practiced efficiency. Despite the adrenaline coursing through him, his focus remained unwavering. He glanced at her briefly, as if to reassure himself that she was truly there, alive and unharmed. "We're not out of danger yet," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his features. She didn't respond verbally, but her expression was resolute. Her kind didn't rely on words as heavily as humans did. Her gratitude was clear in the way her gaze lingered on him. He had risked everything to help her, and she wouldn't forget it. Yet, as the ship moved further from the planet, her thoughts turned to what lay ahead. She tapped the small communication device, typing a single word. "Where?" His fingers paused for a moment before he answered. "There's a system not far from here. It's unmonitored, off the usual trade routes. We can hide there for a while, figure out what to do next." His voice carried an edge of uncertainty. He had planned the escape, but beyond that, his path was as unclear as hers. The journey was quiet, the silence punctuated only by the soft beeping of the ship's controls. She used the time to study him more closely. His face was etched with exhaustion, the lines around his eyes deepened by stress. Yet there was something else, determination, perhaps, or the faint spark of hope. He wasn't like the others she had encountered. He had seen her suffering and chosen to act, even at great personal risk. It was a quality she hadn't expected from a human. As they approached the system he had mentioned, an alarm on the console began to blare. His expression darkened as he scanned the readings. "They're tracking us," he muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. "I knew it was a risk, but they must have tagged the ship before we left." Her gaze sharpened, and she leaned forward, her glowing skin casting a faint light over the console. She tapped the device again, this time more urgently. "Options?" He shook his head. "Not many. We can't outrun them forever. If they catch us, they'll—" His voice trailed off, but the unspoken words were clear. If they were caught, there would be no second chance. She reached for the device, her fingers moving quickly. "Hide?" He considered her suggestion, his brow furrowing in thought. "There's an asteroid field nearby. It's risky, but it might buy us some time." He adjusted the ship's trajectory, the engines groaning as they changed course. The ship plunged into the dense cluster of rocks, the sensors screaming warnings as debris scraped against the hull. The maneuver worked, for now. The pursuing ships hesitated at the edge of the field, unwilling to risk the dangers within. He exhaled a shaky breath, his hands gripping the controls tightly. "That won't hold them off for long. We need a real plan." She typed quickly, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "You!" He looked at her, understanding the weight of her question. "I can't go back," he said simply. "Helping you, it's treason. They'd never let me walk away. But that doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you safe." Her fingers hesitated over the device before she typed. "Together." His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he didn't respond. The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Finally he nodded. "Together," he agreed. "But we need to be smart about this." Their first priority was finding a place to regroup. The asteroid field provided temporary cover, but it wasn't sustainable. He scoured the ship's navigation database, searching for an uninhabited planet or a neutral station where they could lay low. She watched him work, her presence a quiet reminder of what was at stake. Eventually, they found a small moon with a breathable atmosphere and no detectable signs of advanced life. It wasn't ideal, but it was safe, for now. He guided the ship down to the surface, landing in a secluded clearing surrounded by dense vegetation. The moment the engines powered down, the silence was almost overwhelming. He turned to her, his expression serious. "We'll need to stay here for a while, keep the ship hidden. I can rig some basic defenses, but it's not going to be easy." She nodded, her glowing eyes conveying her agreement. She typed another message. "What next?" He ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know," he admitted. "We'll figure it out. One step at a time." The days on the moon were strange and quiet. He set up a makeshift camp, scavenging what he could from the ship's supplies. She explored cautiously, her movements graceful and deliberate. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, there was a sense of tentative peace. For the first time since her capture, she wasn't confined by walls or glass. She could feel the soil beneath her feet, the breeze against her skin. It wasn't home, but it was a start. Their bond grew stronger as they worked together to survive. He taught her how to use the ship's equipment to gather resources, while she showed him how her unique abilities could be used to their advantage. They didn't always need words to communicate. A glance, a gesture, or a faint glow from her skin often conveyed more than language ever could. As the days turned into weeks, they began to talk about the future. He spoke of finding allies, of reaching out to others who might help. She listened, her gaze thoughtful. She had once believed humanity to be irredeemable, But he had shown her that even among the worst, there was potential for good. Perhaps there were others like him, others who would see her not as a monster, but as someone worth saving. One evening, as they sat under the stars, she typed a final question. Why? He looked at her, his expression soft but serious. Because you're not what they said you were, he replied. You're not a monster. You're proof that there's more out there than we understand. And if we can't see that, what's the point of any of this? She didn't respond immediately, her glowing eyes reflecting the starlight. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility that things could change. Together, they had defied the odds, and while their journey was far from over, they had found something neither of them had expected, a reason to keep going.